welcome to episode 32 of the Everyday Sens podcast. I'm Jack Richardson, joined by Brennan Parks for episode 32. Like we said, it's we're chugging along once again with another comparison for you today. If you clicked on the video, the thumbnail, obviously you know it's Ottawa versus Tampa Bay today. We'll get into that in a little bit. We got a little bit of a tire pump for one of our favorite Sens players to get into before we dive into that. So Brennan, how you doing right now? We're recording on Sunday, August 20th.
Doing well. Yeah, we're still getting used to this time difference thing. It's 2:00 for me, 4:00 for Jack. This will come out tomorrow. So usually we record on the day of. I mean, we've been kind of getting in that theme, but I like this whole Sunday recording thing. Nice chill Sunday. So yeah, I mean, not a lot happening in Sens land still. We're still stuck on this whole creating content out of thin air, but this comparison series has gotten a lot of, like, even more than I expected support. People are really into it. So I know people were commenting last time too. It's awesome to see, like, a lot of people, they don't look at the depth charts of other teams. They kind of just focus on the Sens. And I usually do that too. But then looking at the series and going through it gives you a chance to sort of see the different players and different teams and things that maybe you didn't realize. So yeah, I think that's a great series we're doing. And we've got a few more teams we're going to do. Going to skip over some of the lesser bunch, if you know what I'm saying. Montreal, that's you. And yeah, but otherwise, yeah, we're going to get into it. We're going to start with a little talk that we got on NHL Network, which is nice. But yeah, we can get into that. And I'm doing well today. As are you.
Yeah, we're I mean, you gotta love the weekend. Summer's winding down, unfortunately, but it should still be nice for the next little bit. The exciting thing, I mean, the home opener, we can touch on that a little bit too. Like, the tickets seem to be flying off the shelves. I think people are just kind of scrambling to get 300s tickets, so it should be a good atmosphere. And the best part about the home opener, though, is that it's a back-to-back, actually against Tampa Bay in the second game, funny enough. So little link in there. But yeah, we're gonna hit on, and I'm not just gonna say hit on because I feel like we can talk for a long time about this. Just the NHL Network had I don't really know what it was, just a segment, I think, where they were talking about breakout candidates for the 2023-24 season. They mentioned players and then obviously clipped this certain one. They talked about Jake Sanderson for a pretty extended period of time. It was Mike Rupp and Thomas Hickey, actually. I believe that's kind of his, I don't want to say debut on TV, but it's new. He's not usually in that mix, but both of them, and Hickey especially, who was a defenseman and former top-end pick in the draft, had a lot of nice things to say about Jake Sanderson. I think Jake Sanderson, I want to say Hickey just said, we just played it right before we got on here. He said Hickey thought that Sanderson was the most underrated defenseman in the NHL last season. It's high praise, and you've got the quote here on the YouTube page as well. A first-year pro coming out of college to be that good defensively, I haven't seen that before. He has all the tools. It's pretty high praise, and obviously, no slight against Thomas Hickey. He wasn't a stud all-star number one defenseman for sure, but regardless, I think this is just high praise from a guy who isn't an Ottawa, broadcaster, whatever it is. Anyone who watched the Sens every game last year could tell you the same thing. Sanderson was outstanding, but touch on like league recognition a little bit, because let's be honest here, he was snubbed in the face of Owen Power. They had literally parallel seasons, as close as it gets pretty much for two rookie defensemen. But Power got all the attention in the Calder race, and Sanderson wasn't really even sniffing that. So what to me, that's kind of what stands out for me here. It's just attention for Sanderson finally.
It is, and we talked about Sanderson versus Power a lot, and we did the Buffalo comparison as well. Just not even Sanderson versus Power, but in general, Ottawa generally, like, they're a smaller market team stuck between two massive markets, so they don't get a lot of recognition. In this case, they were talking about underrated players, I guess, or breakout candidates for next year. Somebody said Rasmus Sandin just before as well. But Sanderson came up, and Rupp agreed too that, like, he didn't get the recognition last year as much as they kind of thought, and I totally agree. Just because, like, he came out, and I think he was neck and neck with Owen Power, but, like, most of the league would tell you Power was far and away better. Like, that's the opinion. So I think Sanderson, it's tough, but like I said, having him, Shabbat, and Chikrin now, I think Sanderson, like, they're going to be the three-headed monster on Ottawa, and I think the league is going to start to notice. That's kind of a nice little analogy I use there, because, like, next year they're going to come out, and like I said last time, if one of them can step up to be a top 15, then you've got 3 top 30 defensemen. Like, that's insane. I mean, there's not a lot of teams. I don't know if there's any other teams who have 3 defensemen like that. So yeah, Ottawa's in a great spot. Sanderson, the first quote you said is what really stuck out to me. We were listening to it before. I didn't even hear it the first time, but Hickey called him the most underrated player, not defenseman, player in the league last year, which is, like, crazy praise. I mean, you said it, Thomas Hickey's not, like, he wasn't some all-star, but he was a 4th overall pick in 2007. and like he was a consistent NHLer, it's awesome to hear that coming from players, right? Because a lot of the time, I feel like non-players, maybe they don't recognize the little parts of the game. They kind of see the more flashy plays and highlights and stuff. But then you hear like two NHL players, Hickey and Rupp, come out and praise Sanderson for the little things, talk about his defensive play, because that's an area where he really excelled, but it's kind of hard to measure defensive play a lot of the time. Like we've looked at some expected goals against and stuff like that, but I think it's kind of hard to measure defense sometimes. But seeing an actual NHL defenseman praise him for that is awesome. And I think that like NHL Network and those networks producing stuff like this and mentioning Sanderson, that's how players start to get noticed around the league. So I think this is awesome. It's kind of the first step in Sanderson gaining the recognition he deserves. And I think we're only going to see that continue next year because I'm expecting him to take another step. And I'm expecting him to push Chabot and Chychrun for that number one defenseman title on Ottawa, as every team kind of has a number one defenseman, quote unquote. I think they'll split minutes, but Sanderson, I could see by the end of the next year, like people are putting him ahead of Chabot and Chychrun on the depth chart, which is completely insane because don't forget, he is 20 years old right now, I think turning 21 next year. So yeah, awesome for Sanderson. And this was something that I was really happy to see.
He just has that X factor, and we've talked about this. I think it was our first episode actually. I said that he's the guy who's going to win you a Conn Smythe when you're in a playoff series, in a playoff run, right? He's that kind of player, and I personally have him penciled as the number one guy on the blue line, just based on potential alone. Like it doesn't even have to be right now where they sit. I think Chychrun's probably the best defenseman right now, but just health questions with him, and Chabot needs to bounce back. So before he does that, you just have to go off what Sanderson gave you and expect. You don't want to expect regression, so you just expect him to progress, right? So that's what's exciting for me. I think another cool thing that Mike Rupp actually touched on in that same segment is just that they insulated him by getting Chychrun, right? Because this would still be an exciting season coming up for Sanderson if there was no Chychrun, but there'd be a lot more pressure, right? Because it would just be him and Chabot. And while I think they still could have done well with just those two, having Chychrun to insulate, even though he doesn't need insulation, is a good thing. It just adds to that depth. It's having three number one defensemen like we've talked about forever. And I don't even care about other teams saying they don't have three number one defensemen, but they do. And I think objectively, if you're not looking at a Sens bias, and obviously we are, but if this three, if Buffalo got Chychrun, I would say they have three number one defensemen because they do. But right now they just have two, and Ottawa has three, and because they got Chychrun. Buffalo was in the mix for Jacob Chychrun as well. But it's not even about Jacob Chychrun, it's about Jake Sanderson. And everything about him and what he did this year was just phenomenal. I think Travis Hamonic was the one who said it in the year-end press conference, and this might have gotten Hamonic that extra year on the contract. Dorian might have just liked it, but said this kid's going to win Norris trophies one day. And he's not wrong, because I think actually it's coming to me now. I think Hamonic was asked, what do you think about him not being in the Calder? Maybe that was along the lines of the question. And I think Hamonic said it doesn't matter because this kid's going to be in the Norris conversation in no time. So he's not wrong. And like, think about it from a guy who played with him. I think every time Hamonic was kind of asked, how's it going with the mentorship? Because the team made a big deal about that being a pairing. I think they spent more than double the amount of time of any other pairing together, which says that they just wanted that to stay together. And every time Hamonic was asked, it was just, it was like, he doesn't need to learn anything from me. And I love that from Hamonic because he's that kind of player. What I also like, just before I'll throw over to you, his competitiveness. Like he looks like one of those guys who just hates to lose. And I think it was Stutzla when he was mic'd up that one time, just saying you never lose a battle. And that's how you become a good defenseman. And sometimes that might not show up in individual analytics, like, your Corsi and Fenwick and whatever the hell it is. Like I do like analytics, but I think Jake Sanderson's a really good example of why the eye test is important, which is why it's cool hearing NHL Network talk about it, because they actually watched his tape.
Yeah, they did. And Sanderson, well, first I'll touch on Hamonic, just like you said, because I've been kind of harsh on Hamonic and his performance in the ice. But I will say, like, I love listening to his media availabilities and stuff. He is a really good leader. Like, he is the type of guy who I'm okay with bringing back based on the leadership trait, which I'm not usually too fond of, just because if they're not overly good on the ice, that's frustrating. But Hamonic, I don't think he should be paired with Sanderson anymore. I'll get that out of the way. But I do love him coming out and saying that stuff about the Cubs. And like you said, I think he earned some stars in Pierre Dorian's notebook there by praising Sanderson and kind of like being humble about it all and everything. So Sanderson, by the way, also praised Hamonic throughout the year. He said awesome things about playing with him. And obviously that's more like probably mental than anything, I guess you could say, like transitioning to the NHL, being a pro, having a guy like Hamonic. Just imagine yourself being in those shoes, right? You're a 20-year-old turning pro going to the NHL. Like that's so intimidating in my mind, and was never even close to that. So it's like I can just imagine what Sanderson's feeling. But having a guy like Hamonic to lean on, I'm sure that was awesome for him. And then, yeah, the competitiveness. And we see that, honestly, that's one of the things I find with a lot of the players in Ottawa's lineup. And there's some lineups in the league where you look at them and you can see this with a lot of the quote unquote mid teams who are in this repeating cycle of mediocrity where they're stuck in the middle of the pack, is they don't have guys with like certain bite, if that makes sense. Like they have star players, but they're not like they don't push them to the next level. They don't have that competitive. It's not something that everybody has where you have that drive inside of you to win and you hate losing. A lot of guys, I mean, nobody likes to lose, but at the same time, I think some guys really hate losing. Like Brady Tkachuk, I think really hates losing. He despises it. Sanderson seems like he's the same way. His coaches in college said that about him. He's always been the guy too who's like really responsible, going to bed at like 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. and like getting his good night's sleep and everything. The other players on North Dakota talked about him and said like, yeah, he's not a party guy. He wants to just like go to bed early and study and yada yada yada. So we've called him a student of the game. That's another good one. I think he encapsulates like a winner and just the ultimate kind of warrior in a way where he's very intelligent, he's very athletic, like he's a supreme athlete, very smart on the ice. He seems like he's a step ahead of everybody else at all times. He's that type of player. And yeah, I think when it comes playoff time, like he's going to be the guy who, although he's not super loud, seemingly, he seems very quiet in the room, kind of like to himself a little bit, but he's the guy that's going to push others over the edge just by like being him. Like, you look at this guy and you're like, that's Jake Sanderson. That's the type of player he's going to be. So I said it right in the first episode. I think your Conn Smythe analogy was awesome. That's something that I'm like all for, because I think he is the type of guy. They get to the Stanley Cup final and, everybody's looking at Tim Stützle scoring goals and stuff, but then it's Jake Sanderson on the back end who's really like bringing the team together and holding the infrastructure together. So yeah, I love that. Love Sanderson. I really do think that like I did power rankings this past year, every 10, 12 games, where I just kind of ranked like each player by performance. And I really think that Sanderson, and he was high this year, but I think he could end up like number 1 at the end of next year. That's how high I am on him. And to see people around the league not crediting him is wild, because I think they're going to be in for a good shell shocking, because he's going to take the league by storm as a 21-year-old. So yeah, super high on Sanderson.
I'll tell you the time I realized this kid was legit. It was the 2021, I guess, World Juniors. I want to say, I don't know. It was the one right after the 2020 draft. So
where
yeah,
he was
2021.
The captain, or no, before that?
I don't think he was the captain. No, because I think the one he was captain got shut down or something. Like
Oh yeah,
it was when he played. He was on US. I don't think
when
he
they
was
won the gold.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and the Team Canada that year was just stacked. Like they were so good because of COVID, right? They had like Byfield, Bowen Byram. Like it was an awesome Canada team. And in the gold medal game against the States, it was a 2-0 win for the US. Jake Sanderson led the team in ice time by a mile. And that tells you everything to me. You got one game. I think I love these conversations and they're always fun. It's like, if you had one game you had to win, who are you picking? And on the Sens right now, I'm picking Jake Sanderson because of that. And look, until we see this team in the playoffs, it's going to be hard to gauge anyone in that kind of environment. You can go back into junior days, which is what I'm doing with Sanderson, but when it's on the line, he's the type of player you want. You want a guy who's not going to give an inch defensively and has the gazelle-like jump is what I like to call it. I think Carlson had it. Just when they get the puck, they're gone. Sanderson has the same kind of jump. It's quick, it's fast. And for me, I'd even argue that some Sens fans underrated him this year. And I think that's okay, because yeah, he was a rookie. It was a little slower maybe offensively than we planned and what we wanted or what we needed from him at times. I would die on the hill that he should have been running the power play unit, the first power play unit, for much longer than he did, with a mix of how well he was playing and just I wasn't a fan of the way Chabot was running it up there. And most of it to me is just due to how quick he is. He does everything hard. Like every pass he makes and his feet are fast along the blue line. And to me,
Such a good skater, man.
that's the thing. And as a quarterback on the power play, that's like, it's so important. And it's not really anything against Thomas Chabot, but it's just like, he's that good. He's that kind of player where you just kind of tip your cap at some point. So I just love the way he plays. Another thing too about Sanderson is just I mentioned, the offense might have been a bit slower, but if you look at his season at the under 18 program, which is when he got drafted before he went to North Dakota, I think the first half of that year, I don't think he had very many points. And then he kind of picked it up halfway through the season or something. So he had a really good back half. Then he goes to North Dakota. His first season there doesn't do anything crazy offensively. The second year he had, COVID delays, injuries, so he didn't play a ton, but his point per game was on par with Cale Makar's second season in college. That's not a typo. Everyone can go look up the stats. I'm saying on par. It wasn't exactly the same. A little bit less games for Sanderson, I believe, but the pace was there for Cale Makar-like numbers. And I think Sanderson played about 30 games in college as a defenseman. That's outstanding. And that, to me, again, was another signal that this kid is legit. And when he got to the NHL last summer, I mentioned it. It was all about, is he good enough to be penciling in as a top four defenseman, right? Like, that was the question going in. Now we're not even really asking. It's is he the best on the team? Like, it's a worthy debate. So yeah, I'm so thrilled with Jake Sanderson. The only thing now, though, let's just talk about it now. What would you pay him? Because I believe we have hit on this a little bit. He switched agents this summer. So ideal contract for Jake Sanderson for you if he signs tomorrow.
Oh, I would offer him 8x8 right now. I did say that earlier this summer. Just like right now, if I'm Dorion, I'm reaching out and I'm giving him 8x8. I think Tim Stützle is the perfect example of why you should do that. Last summer they signed Timmy to that 8x8.35 a year contract, and people overreacted around the league. They thought that it was silly. I say this because yesterday I saw this comment from ages ago that just got like another like, so it pops back up in your feed that I had. And I said, like, in a year from now, everyone's going to think this is like the best contract in the league. And that's why I think they should do the same with Sanderson, because people thought that was crazy for Tim Stützle. He was not even close to a point per game last year and everything else. And then, this year he blows up for 90 points and everybody's like, wow, they have the best contract in the league. And it's only been like a calendar year. So I think the same will happen for Sanderson. Just because people around the league aren't recognizing it yet doesn't mean Dorion has to kind of be sheltered and nervous about signing him. I think you absolutely send him an 8x8 contract. I also think Sanderson, it would probably be in his best interest to wait until next year and then sign a monster contract. I was really shocked that Timmy even agreed to that. I think Tim really bought into the team idea because, like, if I'm his agent, like, I would have told Tim, nah, like, just hold off for another year, wait till you blow up. I mean, there's no rush. Again, players like security too, right? To know they have that long-term deal in place. So Sanderson, yeah, I think I would offer him 8x8. I'd probably go even higher than 8x8 right now. I'd probably go up to like 8.59. And I mean, I think that at the end of next year, it's going to be the same as Tim, where if you wait right now and he doesn't sign, because he doesn't have to right now, if he signs next year, next offseason, I think you're going to have to pay him like 10 million plus. I'm really on that boat of like at least 9 million plus, more than you would have had to this summer. So I think it would be in Jake's best interest to wait. But as we've seen with so many players in this team, they buy into the team mantra and really into the whole, like if Sanderson gets locked up, they've got almost every core player under contract long term. Chychrun might be the only one who's not really, and even he's signed for another couple of years. So I think, yeah, 8x8 for me. What would you offer him right now?
It's somewhere in that ballpark for sure in terms of offering. There's a couple factors though, because the Stützle comparison is so fair, and they're going to be linked their whole career, even if they don't even both end up staying in Ottawa the whole time. Like they were picked 3 and 5 to the same team. Like, they're going to be linked. The difference to me is I go back to this quote from Stützle when he signed. I think it was last September, so just when training camp was opening for Timmy. I like going back to the quote where he said, "My parents don't have to work anymore." That's what I like. It was it was so wholesome. Like, it was awesome. Like, just kind of hits the feels right there. But the difference, I think, and I think the reason Tim just did it right away, he doesn't really come from a hockey family, and I say that not in a negative connotation, but it's a humble. When we had Ian on, he was talking about visiting his home, and it's just he's a very normal person who just happens to be the highest paid Ottawa Senator of all time now, right? But with Sanderson, it's not to say that Sanderson's going to sit there and be more greedy or whatever and like pinch pennies with the Senators, but his dad played in the NHL and had a lot of NHL experience, so he might be advising his kid, much like Brady Tkachuk, who ended up having a massive holdout, where just saying, listen, you don't sign at all this summer. Like, that would be not in Sanderson's best interest at all. Like, he would probably be sacrificing tens of millions of dollars career-wise if he does that. If I was Sanderson's agent, who he recently just switched to, I would be telling him, look, let's wait until next summer at the earliest. Then even at that point, I might be even considering a bridge deal if I'm Sanderson. I think right now, I don't know if it's probably pretty uncommon to sign like a bridge deal a year out from anything. So if nothing happens, this is a guess. If nothing happens before the season starts, I'd expect it'll go until next summer. I don't think we'll get a midseason long-term deal, but again, I'm completely guessing there. I have no idea. No one does really. But yeah, obviously if I'm the Sens and I'm hard on Dorion, but he's smart enough to know that you got to lock this guy up. He's done it twice now with Stützle and I guess Tkachuk as well to a degree. So to me, like those are the guys. It's Stützle, Tkachuk, and Sanderson. Then you've got the depth. I say depth, in Norris, Batherson, Chychrun, like you said. But getting Sanderson to some kind of number long term is should be the key. Should be the next contract key moving forward. Aside from his college teammate Shane Pinto, who's clock's ticking here a little bit for Pinto. But another thing though that I didn't even mention is Owen Power, another guy who's going to be attached to the hip with for their career. They both have 1 year left on their entry level deals. What stone's going to fall first here? Like, is it if I could see if Power gets signed first, I could see the Sens, in a negotiation, just saying, listen, he's better, or that's what it'll come to. But I think those two, the whatever deals they sign are going to be quite similar, bridge or long term or whatever. So it's pretty interesting to think about, but a very important deal. Not one that we need to be stressing about though, because dead cap comes off next season. They've got a lot of space. Like the Sens are in a decent spot now after this DeBrincat deal, and they've got a lot of flexibility next summer with Tarasenko, Kubalik, and obviously Sanderson needing new deals. So it'll be interesting. But yeah, you've got the Tampa page pulled up there, I believe. So let's Tampa Bay Lightning, the class of the NHL for the last decade, let's say. We ran through the Bruins and how much success they've had regular season wise. All the regular season success that the Bruins have had, the Tampa Bay Lightning have done in the playoffs. They had previously the best record in 2019, like best NHL season ever in 2019. Get swept in the first round, obviously. Then they go and win 2 back-to-back cups. They're an absolute dynasty, and they've been a thorn in the side of Sens fans and every team in the Atlantic, basically, let's say, for the last little while. So let's go head-to-head comparison with the depth charts. If you want to get going here with the top line, we can pull that up and let's just have at it.
Yeah, for sure. So Tampa, obviously, like we were talking about it a little bit before the pod, and that's that they, like, a lot of us kind of grew up idolizing some of these players, just like in our minds they're these superstars, and they are. But at the same time, I think age is important, and I think we do have to recognize that Tampa at some point, like Boston, is going to regress. So let's preface it with that. Ian came on and he said he had talked to John Cooper, and John Cooper told him, who obviously is the coach of the Lightning, told him that at some point there's going to be a chaotic season in which Tampa and like Boston and these other top dogs regress in the East, and then Ottawa and Buffalo and these other teams kind of go up, and everybody's just on a similar platform in regards to where they are. So I'm hoping that's this year, and yeah, we're going to talk about it. So first off, Tampa very much top heavy in a way. Like they've got Steven Stamkos, Braden Point, and Nikita Kucherov on the top line. Again, we'll mention, just because I'm sure we'll have some Tampa fans who haven't watched our last episodes. This is the depth chart, which we believe is sorted by salary. That's kind of what we figured out, but the lines might vary a little bit. Regardless, we're kind of talking about it more as player tiers than actual lines, so just keep that in mind. But we'll start with Stamkos, Point, and Kucherov versus Tkachuk, Stützle, and Tarasenko is basically the way that it's going to line up here. So I think obviously Stamkos isn't quite what he used to be now at 33 years old, but he's still putting up, over a point per game and over 30 goals, which is pretty insane. Kucherov, 100 plus point player, and Point, probably the most underrated center in the league by a lot of people. Very, very good, like arguably like probably top 5 center, or at least top like 6 or 7 center in my mind anyway. So, I mean, I think here right now you have to take Tampa's group over Ottawa's, just because like Kucherov's still this absolute phenom of a player. Like I said, Point is one of the few centers who I'd put above Timmy, just in regards to where they are. Again, I think Tim has potential to pass even a player like Point, but is it going to happen yet? I don't know. So right now I'm definitely taking Tampa's group, and I think like maybe you could take Tkachuk over Stamkos where they are at this point, but I just think there's too much power on Tampa's top line here and their top trio in regards to where they are in tiers. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I think Kachuk and Stamkos is probably the only like coin, I don't want to say coin flip even, but at the end of the day, if it's a coin flip, I'm gonna go with the guy with the experience and just until Brady Kachuk goes out and has a monster year or does stuff in the playoffs like Stamkos was doing, then it's easier. Like again, I think most and look, the last teams that we've done, other than Buffalo, um, the top line for every other team has been better than the Sens. And that's not a slight on the Sens. Like we love their top line. I think it was fantastic last year. We're putting Tarasenko there just for depth chart reasons, but again, like you can swap Tarasenko, Giroux. It's the same story again. Like it's this line is one of the best in the NHL. If they're all three of them are together, they're one of those lines where when they go over the boards, you're like, oh no. And as a fan, when you're watching the game, you just say, oh no, they're that good. So I think Braden, I think that thing about Point being the most underrated center in the league is spot on too. I think, you before we recorded, you popped it up and you were like, I didn't know he had 50 goals last year, which is so fair because neither did I. And Kucherov just with us like 30 goals, but 113 points. Like it's just nuts, these guys, right? And I really do. Like they're again one of the best teams in the last decade, probably the best in the last decade. So having that top line be better than the Sens is not a bad thing. This is where things are going to get interesting though. So I'll skip ahead here to the second line. I'm a big fan of Anthony Cirelli. He's again also one of the best defensive centers in the league, I think, and I don't think that's crazy to say. Gets a lot of good matchups and takes matchups away from Point and Stamkos and Kucherov, which is good. I like Jeannot and Hagel a lot too. I'll be real here, and I think Jeannot just a crazy trade. I think that's going to kind of unfortunately just follow him around until he does something of significance in Tampa because they did 5 or 6 draft picks for him, which was a heavy overpay. But I like those two wingers a lot, and I'll say I've got Brandon Hagel who had 64 points last year. Again, another sleeper offensively. I'm going to take him over Batherson. Just again, until Batherson can string together a full year of being a point per game guy, which we know he can do. He was doing it before the high ankle sprain. He's got that potential. But Hagel's young, man. He's 24. Like Batherson, I think, is 23. He might actually be turning 24 this coming up season. So the age thing doesn't really work out in the Sens' favor in that regard. But I'm taking Giroux, and I'm going to take Josh Norris over Cirelli because Norris also has the defensive kind of pedigree, I want to say. Not like he's going to be a Selke candidate, but he's a centerman who's put up 35 goals in 66 games. A 40-goal centerman can't be scoffed at, and I think ideally you're going to take that as a second liner over Cirelli. Now, if Cirelli was your third line center, which I think the Lightning have done, they've gone Point, Stamkos, Cirelli, different story, but in terms of depth chart, Cirelli's technically their second best centerman, so I'm going to put him on the second line, and I'm going to take Norris and Giroux over them. So I'm taking the Sens second line, but I like Hagel a lot. I really do. I think he's a great player.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I think there's kind of a theme here we have going with these comparisons in the sense that I think Ottawa's middle six is better than most teams' middle sixes, just kind of based on the trades they made, acquiring Kubalik and now like having that Pinto on the third line, Norris coming back from injury. Last year, obviously, with Norris out, that would have been the complete opposite because Pinto was thrusted into a second line role. But I think a lot of people are underrating the fact that they're getting Norris back around the league. So for me, I would agree. I'd say Hagel over Batherson based on this past year. But I do think, and this is another theme for me, is I think that Ottawa, what I love about them is that they have so much potential. Like we're basing everything on the past seasons, but I also think like they should be expected to improve. It's just kind of impossible to say like, yeah, Batherson's going to go from negative 35 or whatever he was to a positive player. Like you can't just say that and assume it's going to happen. I would definitely think, and based on what he said about recognizing how he struggled defensively and stuff, and on that ankle, I think he will be a lot better than he was last year, just overall as a two-way player. But you can't really prove that until it happens, right? It's one of those things you have to see it to believe it. So for now, I think, yeah, Hagel definitely like 30 goals and 64 points. Not all about points, but I think he's entering his prime too. Like it's just kind of hard to pass on him for Batherson, who really struggled in his own end of the ice last year. So I think I would agree, but then Norris definitely over Cirelli. I also like Cirelli, but I think he isn't he just doesn't compare to Norris if Norris is healthy in my mind. I think Norris was a 35 goal scorer in 66 games. And obviously, like you said, he's a good two-way center as well. So Again, really think people are underrating the impact of Norris. He is a game changer for sure in my mind. And then you've got Jeannot too, who, yeah, I mean, he's a good player, but like he really struggled last year in comparison to what he was supposed to do when they traded for him. So I think he's in a greater role than he probably should be too. So in my mind, I'm definitely taking Giroux like 100 out of 100 times in that, and I would also take Tarasenko 100 out of 100 times over Jeannot. So you can shuffle it however you want. I'm still taking 2 out of 3 Ottawa Senators on that second line. Um, and yeah, so it's kind of like Tampa's first line, Ottawa's second line, and then we move into the third line, which, as I just kind of alluded to, we're putting Ridley Gregg there. It could be somebody else, Matthew Joseph, if they figure out the money, but we think Joseph's going to be traded, so we're excluding him from this. If any Tampa fans are watching, because obviously they traded Joseph for Paul. He's currently excluded from our lineup, but we'll get into that if he gets traded or if they clear money somehow else. But yeah, we've got Gregg, Pinto, and Kubalik on Ottawa's third line. And then on Tampa's, it's Connor Sheary, Nick Paul, and Michael Esimont. I believe that's how you say his name. So again, Tampa's third line. Obviously, we know Nick Paul, and Nick Paul is very good. He does everything. It's Paul does it all. Like he's the ultimate kind of jack of all trades, but he's also not a game changer. Paul, I wouldn't say like he's a great third line center. I think it's hard to say you take him over Pinto, but I think I'd take Paul over Pinto based on right now, just because Paul, like I said, the experience doing it all. And experience has to be mentioned in this comparison too, because Tampa, a lot of these players have been to multiple Stanley Cups and in the playoffs. And I think that does translate to their overall play during the season too. That experience is just something you can't replace unless you've been there. And nobody on Ottawa's roster except for Giroux and Tarasenko have been there. And so it's like, I mean, that has to be factored in too. But I think I'd take Paul over Pinto, and then Gregg's a hard one because Ridley Gregg obviously hasn't solidified himself as a full-time NHL player, but I do expect him to be a pretty impactful third-line player for them this year. I was much higher on him than people were during his 20 games last year. Struggled to score goals and produce. I think that's kind of why he got sent down as well. But the fact that he could keep his own, not even keep his own, but excel alongside Claude Giroux, those two connected so well, like that says something to me about Gregg. And I think he's going to produce a significant amount of points because like he has that flair, and to be able to read where Claude Giroux is going to be. I watched some of his highlights, and to be able to like thread the needle on a pass and predict where Giroux is going to be, like that's not easy, and not everybody can do that. So I do see Gregg as being a big piece. I guess I'd put him like equal to Connor Sheary. I mean, Sheary's kind of a guy that's been on a bunch of teams, good third line player, but he's not anything special. Like he doesn't really do anything that most third line players don't do. I'd say Gregg kind of brings that tenacity too, which is nice. And then I'm obviously going to take Kubalik over Esimont just because Esimont hasn't really shown a whole lot. I mean, he was a rookie this past year, I think, or maybe he was a career AHL player beforehand. 26 years old. Not super familiar with him. Noticed him in the playoffs a couple of times, but I think Kubalik, you have to take him with the proven kind of track record there. Overall, I'm taking Ottawa's third line over Tampa's. Like I said, I think I would take Ottawa's middle six over most teams' middle sixes just because they've really bolstered that depth by acquiring Kubalik and then signing Tarasenko. They have a very strong middle six group of players and top 9 overall too, honestly. Like I'd take Ottawa's top 9 hesitantly over Tampa's as a whole. I say hesitantly because we come into that debate where you've got like Kucherov in the top tier and maybe Point in the top tier, and then you've got like Kachuk, Stützle, Stamkos, and then so it's that debate of McAvoy too with the Bruins and Dahlin with Buffalo of do having one or two top tier players overcome having a weaker top 9 overall. Like you guys can decide that, everybody watching. For me, I would still take the really good 3 lines over one kind of stack line. That's just my perspective on it. But I think that they're fairly equal if you factor in having 2 top tier players on Tampa's group. But yeah, for me, you can talk about the third line a little bit. I'm taking Ottawa's third line, but I'm taking Nick Paul over Shane Pinto at center.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. We're usually pretty in sync with these. I think like I was looking at Nick Paul, and I do but it's hard to believe like if he was the third line center going into next year for Ottawa, I don't know how confident I am. I think with Pinto, it's the potential, right? Nick Paul is what he is. That's his stat line. He's 32 points, 17 goals in 80 games. That's what he's going to give you. But obviously, it's to compete in the playoffs and it's all that. It's important. But Pinto's ceiling is higher, so I'm going to go with Pinto. I'm going to take Ottawa's entire third line over this. I'm not going to lie, because I look at it as I've tried to do this because it seems like most mock lineups that we've seen so far have had some kind of rookie or entry level deal on the third line. Not that Esimont is one, like he's 26 years old, but he's filling that role of just the guy on the entry level league minimum kind of deal. which is what Ridley Gregg, will be next year. So that's how I'm going to compare it. I think actually for me, Connor Sherry and Kubalik is a little closer than I thought it would be, to be honest. Kubalik's going to give you the goals, but I do like Sherry. I think he's a pretty decent player. And I think that was a good pickup for them. The thing that's so impressive about Tampa, so just before I go on here, like I am taking Ottawa's third line, proposed third line on paper. A lot of it's a big if still for Ottawa, right? You got to move Joseph out if you want to sign Pinto. They have to sign Pinto in the first place. Like there's still some work to be done for Ottawa. But the penciled in stuff, even if it's Joseph in that role, let's say, and someone else, like I've seen people kind of speculating on maybe trading Kubalik because there hasn't been any, like media stuff for him at all since the trade, which is a little strange. And he could be a guy who they might flip or something. I don't know. But if that's the case, then we'll go from there. But even if it's Joseph in that spot and not Kubalik, I still like Joseph to bounce back a little bit. Ironically, that him and Paul are kind of were traded for each other. It'd be, it's interesting that they're both now on the third lines. So yeah, like the impressive thing about Tampa is that they've been able to add and just subtract and lose people from the third line and just be so competitive still. Like that's, I think, what is going to be their biggest question mark. Like if I'm a Tampa Bay fan going into next season, we've got rest now, which is a big thing. They haven't had a full off season where they haven't had a long playoff run in 3 years, which is crazy. So a full year of rest for them could be big, but the question is going to be, is this third line that they've got on paper right here, is that good enough for being a top team in the Atlantic? And if it isn't, are the top guys going to be good enough again for a top 3 team in the Atlantic? Because last year they were. Clearly, look at the point distribution here. It was a top, very, very top heavy team in Tampa. Hagel, other than the top 3 guys there, Hagel had the most points, and then the next is 37 from Sheary, who wasn't even on Tampa at the time. So they had a very significant hit to their depth as the years have gone by. So I'm curious, but I do think Ottawa has better middle 6, and I'll even stretch it. We'll go in the fourth line here. That I could see that fourth line being good, but those are just a bunch of just players, and obviously Logan Brown's there. I forgot Logan Brown was signed by the Lightning or picked up by them. That kind of slipped under my radar a little bit, but I mean, he's a guy who could somehow show up and just be a solid middle 6 player, right? Like he had that potential when he was drafted. I'll believe it when I see it though. So for the time being, I'm going to say no, he won't be. So I like Ottawa's fourth line more. I think Tampa kind of changed their fourth line here, got rid of Pat Maroon, which was pretty like he was on there for a long time. So what do you think about the fourth line? We can just round out the forwards here because I think I'm really interested to go into the defensemen, to be honest.
Yeah, the fourth line, again, we've talked about it. Ottawa's is still very unsolidified. I mean, they signed Zach McEwen, but I don't expect him to be an everyday NHL player. He currently lines up on their fourth line, and Parker Kelly's on a one-way deal. If we're talking, I mean, honestly, like I kind of like every variation of Ottawa's over Tampa's just because for one, I'm not high on Logan Brown, but I'm especially not high on him as a fourth line player. He's not a physical, gritty guy. His game is pretty much skill. Like he's a massive dude, but he doesn't use his body and he's not physical at all. So he's not really an ideal fourth line candidate. He kind of needs to be in a more offensive role to ever succeed. So him and then Glendening and Archibald, I mean, they're kind of just plug-in players. I think Mark Kastelik is far superior to everyone on that fourth line for Tampa. Kastelik, again, I think he's one of Ottawa's most underrated players by Sens fans. He's very, very good. He had like a 56.5 faceoff percentage last year or something. Excellent fourth line center. I think if Ottawa's fourth line looks something like Yuri Schmeichel, Mark Kastelik, and Angus Crookshank, that's my ideal fourth line. I think that would be excellent. Obviously, we don't know a lot about Schmeichel, but I'm just, you could plug in a different player there, maybe a Sokolov or something too. For example, I'd love to see Crookshank make the team, regardless of who it is. I think Ottawa's bottom 6. That's kind of how we've been comparing it. I'd take their bottom 6 over Tampa's by quite a significant margin. Tampa's first line and then Ottawa's kind of bottom 9 is favored in my mind as they are. I think Ottawa has a very good forward core. Like this has kind of been the theme, is that there's a couple players on each team. Like we talked Matthew Tkachuk, right? And then you had David Pasternak. Like there's 1 or 2 players on each team and each forward group that I would take over Ottawa's, but then Ottawa kind of has the better depth, which is something that we haven't been able to say in the past. So I think that's awesome. And I don't think it's biased to say that either, because I think it's fair that Ottawa has among the best forward depth in the league, aside from their unsolidified fourth line right now. So do you want to hit on that defense first? I know you're eager to get into this comparison. We can do the top 4 again if you'd rather, and just kind of go from there. But yeah, you can get into it first.
Sure, yeah. So this is where it gets interesting for me. Victor Hedman, obviously, I think by a lot of accounts had a very down year last year, just 49 points, 76 games. Like it wasn't a Hedman-esque kind of season, let's say, but he's a Norris Trophy winner. He's one of when he's at the top of his game, one of the best defensemen in the league. That can't be disputed. So I think you have to assume he's going to bounce back. I mentioned the rest for these guys, like how big that's going to be for Tampa. I think a player like him who plays so much, he'll be the biggest benefactor from that. He's 6'6" and just like dominates out there all the time. So he's one of those players that can be your best player kind of thing, right? I like Chernak a lot too. I think this top four. Listen, it's a top three here. Like it's down to Perbix versus Zub in my opinion, and Perbix has been a depth defenseman for them. I'm not saying that if Artem Zub gets thrown on this team, he's immediately better than Perbix and immediately on that second pair, first pair, whatever it is. Um, but I'll take Ottawa's just in the sense that yeah, Hedman's the best defenseman of the group, and I don't think that's crazy to say. You could honestly even make the argument that Sergachev is a tier ahead of the Sens defenseman right now when he's at the top of his game. But I'm just going to take the Sens core of three over the Lightning core of three. And I know that kind of contradicts exactly what I just said, but it's closer than I think we might, or some fans might be willing to say, because a lot of what I said, like if Hedman bounces back, if Chernak, I think had some health issues, he got the concussion in the playoffs and everything like that. So, he's had a lot of them in the past. So if he can bounce back, like that's a lot of ifs. With Ottawa, the only if on the blue line to me, like the big one that kind of matches up is Chikrin's health. If Chikrin can give you 60 games like we've talked about, I'm taking Ottawa's top three over this. And then also, like we'll talk about depth, I'm taking Eric Brandstrom over Hayden Fleury. I'm taking Hamonic over Bogosian, like however you want to call it. I like Ottawa's defense better than Tampa's if Victor Hedman isn't a Norris level defenseman. So that's the if for me, because our if in Ottawa is if one of those three can put themselves in that top 15 conversation, which they all have the potential to do. But Hedman's already there. And even if he has a bad year, he's probably still a top 15 guy. So that's the only, iffy thing about it. But it's closer than I think. I don't know, closer than I think other fans might be willing to say. But we've both been very confident in the blue line all summer since they made that Chikrin trade.
We have been, and what I'm noticing looking at this Tampa roster a little bit more is that they look very much like Boston to me in the sense that they have more top heavy forwards than Boston did, but like their defense, they have a good top four, not as good as Boston's, I wouldn't say, but then that comes down to the goaltender again, which we'll get into. Very similar in that sense. Yeah, there is a lot of ifs here because Hedman, like you said, down year, 32 years old. Does he, is he past his prime truly and starts to regress, or is he just, going to bounce back? Chernak, I really do like as well. I think Ottawa does have a nicer group with Zub than they do with Perbix, but at the same time, Sergachev, like I'm assuming he had an excellent season this past year. So a lot of ifs. It's kind of hard to gauge where they're at exactly based on regression and stuff. But I think I'm going to say the same thing as I said with Boston is that I'd probably take Ottawa's group of three, like you did, because I think that they have a better game breaking ability. Like I think that having Shabbat, Chikrin, and Sanderson, who are all three of them, like I've said, could be like top 30 to top 20, and one of them should emerge into like the top 15. Having those three, and I think those three are all superior to Chernak in my mind. And then you've got Hedman and Sergachev, who are probably on par to above them. It's tough. Like I personally really, really like Ottawa's group of three because they're all game breakers. Like Chernak is a great compliment to Hedman, I think. And I do think he's a really good defenseman, but he's not that game breaker. He's more of that shutdown guy. I think Ottawa's three are all like they will on any team influence the outcome of a game. So for that reason, I like their group of three more. However, I would probably put them as equal right now just because I think Hedman and Sergachev kind of have the edge. And unless Hedman continues to regress, I think they're going to kind of continue to have that edge. However, like I said, you then factor in Zub versus Perbix, and suddenly it's like, okay, I think these two top fours are kind of on par, but I think Ottawa has the potential to have more star power in the sense that they have three game breakers, which is kind of my overall point on it. So, yeah, go ahead if you got something.
I like the way you broke that down way more than I did, to be honest. I was kind of all over the place, but that makes a lot of sense because we were doing the tiers we've been doing tiers more with the defensemen for the teams. We had Dahlin and McAvoy as the trump cards kind of, whereas I think Hedman and Sergachev are probably the two best in the group. But you're right. Then it's Chabot, Chikrin, Sanderson, and no one else on Tampa's list is close to that. Then you probably go Zub, maybe even Perbix a little bit lower. Like, yeah, so it's more of a, again, with the same as the forwards, it's a quantity over quality kind of thing for the Sens, right? And not to say that their quality isn't good, but they just got a lot of good pieces in total. So I like that. We don't need to spend too much time on the goaltending. This is Vasilevsky, the best goaltender in the league, still in my opinion. I mean, look at those numbers, and that was a bad year for him. He had a 2.65 goals against average and a 9.15 save percentage. We'd be begging for that for any goalie in Ottawa. I think that was our benchmark. You know, we want both of them to be near 910, I think is what we said. So, yeah, Vasilevsky's a game breaker. 60 games, like he's their MVP every year, always has been, always will be. He's just fantastic to watch. So, yeah, I got nothing else for Tampa, to be honest. Like the thing is with them, it's just age, and the more you look at I think their depth up front is going to struggle. So the thing that's interesting is you look at Hedman's points versus Sergachev's points, and I know Sergachev ran the power play, and not that that was new. I think maybe they did that a couple of years ago or whatever, but to me that's indicative of just Tampa not having enough depth offensively, right? Like they in a way maybe they kind of suffered from what Ottawa did last year in the sense that their top line was stellar, top power play was elite, but then it was just a little bit dry everywhere else. It's kind of what Ottawa had, and the reason I'm still confident in Ottawa is that Ottawa's got the pieces now to fulfill that, right? And I don't know if Tampa does. Like I don't know if Hagel, Sorelli, and Jeannot are going to put up 60 points each on that second line. Whereas you could reasonably expect the Sens second line to each get 60 plus. I don't think that's crazy to expect out of them. So it's interesting. I think this is actually a very good. I mean, this is the comparison of all comparisons. You want to be comparing yourself to the class of the Eastern Conference for the last few years. And we just did that with the Bruins and now the Lightning. So it's a bit different. Obviously, the Bruins just lost two huge pieces. But I'll ask you one here, just kind of on the spot. Who would you take right now as it stands, Bruins or the Lightning? Like who's going to be a tougher team for Ottawa to pass in the standings, you think?
I'm saying Tampa. I'm very much of the belief that losing Bergeron, Krejci will severely hamper the Bruins. Now, if Boston, I know we had some comments on the last one saying that they're probably going to acquire a centerman. I know you mentioned Mark Scheifele. If they go out and they do trade for someone of that caliber, I think it changes things. But right now, with Pavel Zacha as their first line center, I'm taking Tampa. And I'll just touch on Tampa a little more. Just Vasilevsky, I think, is sort of a trump card too in the whole lineup. That's the really hard thing. It's same with Allmark. It's like Ottawa's, you can compare the goalies, but just the lineups as a whole, I like Ottawa's forwards and defense more overall. Like if you look at the group of 12 and then the group of 6, I like each of those groups more than Tampa's. However, I think you look at Vasilevsky, and if again, like it's just so hard to beat Vasilevsky. Like he's such a game-breaking goaltender that like that's still, you can pretty much put them against any team in the league and say, well, we've got Andre Vasilevsky. So it's certainly tough. I do think, though, talking Tampa and Boston, I think that Ottawa should be right there with both of them, just for the fact that, like, we just looked at Tampa's lineup, and yeah, they still have Stamkos, they have Point, they have Kucherov, they have Hedman, they have Vasilevsky. I love that core group of players, but like after those players, and Sergachev too, after those players, it's fairly weak. Like they don't have a whole lot that I would favor over Ottawa. So I guess it kind of comes down to, can those players I just mentioned still lift Tampa to be a Stanley Cup contending team and a playoff team? Or is regression going to start to set in? And in John Cooper's words to Ian Mendez, is it going to be that chaotic season where they start to regress and Boston does too, and then Ottawa really takes the next step, and so does Buffalo and these other teams? That's kind of what it comes down to me. It's impossible to know right now. Based on the lineups, like I said, I like Ottawa's players more, but I think that Tampa has more star power at the very top tier. So it comes down to that whole, is depth or star power more important? We've learned via Toronto that depth is more important in the playoffs. However, getting to the playoffs is a whole nother story, and you kind of need to have both elements, which I think Ottawa does. But I'm interested to see, especially if, like, at the end of this year, we should come back to this. If Tim Stützle and Brady Tkachuk and those top guys for Ottawa and Sanderson especially, if they've surpassed some of these guys on Tampa who we currently have a lot of above them in the tiers, like, do you think that at the end of this year, Tim Stützle could be like either equal to or above Braden Point's level? And Point is obviously a big one, but like I feel like at the end of this year, if they take another step, we could very much be considering Ottawa's top guys equal to above Tampa's top guys. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. And look, like it's hard if we're doing based on playoff performance, then Tampa's going to trump everyone, right? I think they're just going to be better because they've actually won cups. Other than Colorado, you can't really look at any other team's core in the league and say that they're worse or better or whatever. But yeah, I think that's fair. Like Tampa's got the best that we've seen so far. I think like the best 5-man lineup, right? And best starting lineup. If you need a goal last minute, you're throwing these 5 guys out with an extra attacker. Like they've got the best one. You get Sergachev, Hedman, that top line, and throw out Hagel. Like that's an elite 6-man unit, but it's the depth. You're right, and that depth has taken a hit over the years. It's the cost of winning cups in the cap world. I wanted to touch on Vasilevsky again because you're right. He's not just a trump card for goalies. He's a trump card for rosters. He's that good. He is, honest to God, like a Hart candidate if he's on his game. What's scary is I remember after the first round, like locker room cleanout day for the Lightning this year, I think he said, I didn't feel good this year. He played, I'm not pulling that out. Like he mentioned something about the rest, and that's why I kept mentioning the rest. And he still played 60 games, had a 9.15 and a 2.65 goals against average. That's terrifying. I think that's absolutely terrifying. If he comes in on a mission next year, Tampa could win the division, and I don't think that's crazy. I would say Tampa and Toronto are my 2 picks to win the division. I'm assuming the Leafs are just kind of stand pat with their core and just do the last dance kind of thing. But we'll get into that. We'll compare the Leafs and the Sens at a later date. But with Tampa, man, like if Vasilevsky gives you 60 plus games of even better numbers than that, this team's going to challenge for the division. No doubt in my mind. No doubt in my mind, regardless of their depth. Depth will probably come back to bite them in the playoffs if they don't upgrade it at the deadline or whatever. But this is I don't want to say you forget about Vasilevsky, but maybe him and Shesterkin, I would say, like there's, and like Sorokin, Saros, you could throw in there, Hellebuck. Like there's 5 goalies, I think, in the NHL that change your look on a team. And Vasilevsky is the best one of that crop. And he could very well be the reason that they end up still making the top 3 in the division next year. And look, man, like it's not just important to break down these teams for the Sens to make the playoffs. It's cool to do it because if we want the Sens to finish top 3 in the division, they're probably going to end up playing one of these teams in the first round. So it's important in that regard too. Like we're sizing up playoff matchups here. It's almost like the NFL or I'm thinking of another sport here, but like you got to build your team to beat your opponent, not just to win games or what you think will win games, if that makes sense, right? I think Toronto beefed up at both deadlines the past 2 years to beat Tampa in the first round. That was their goal. And they succeeded this year. So I think that's all kind of it. We milked that camel or milked that cow or whatever you want to say. So yeah, man, Tampa again, I got another perspective. I think I'm more appreciative of how good their top guys were last year. Braden Point, probably one of the most underrated players in the league. So if you have anything else just on the Tampa Bay Lightning, if you want to tease our next comparison, I don't even know if we've decided who we're doing yet, but you can just go ahead and do it. There's I think 4 other teams we wanted to touch on for sure.
Yeah, maybe we should like do a vote. Maybe we should leave it up to a vote for people. Maybe I'll put a vote up on a story or on Twitter or something, just because like we don't want to do the lesser teams who we know are just going to favor Ottawa overall. I think Toronto is going to be a big one. I think we've got New Jersey because Ottawa's on a similar timeline to them, and I think that would be cool to kind of compare the players. Like they have a lot of comparative pieces in those lineups. New York, the Rangers, I think we wanted to do. And I don't know if there was another one. Pittsburgh, maybe we could do as well, just because they're also going to be competing. I think those are really the 4 teams who Ottawa is going to be fighting with for the playoffs that we haven't touched on. Do you think there's anyone else, or I think that's pretty much good, eh?
That might be it, but I have a suspicion that if we do a poll, everyone's going to say the Leafs, so maybe we do the Leafs first and then go over to the Metro. So we'll stay tuned for that on Twitter and Instagram, but we've got some like 3-4 more teams to do here. So I'm loving doing these. This has been a great little off-season exercise just to size up the opponents for next season. Like we mentioned earlier in the show, though, this is going to be part 2 of the doubleheader opening weekend at the Canadian Tire Center on Sunday, October 15th, I want to say. So it'll be a good weekend. It'll be a good way to just size up the team and just hit the ground running, I should say, for the Ottawa Senators. They got Carolina on October 11th. Then they come home and play the Flyers, and then the Tampa Bay Lightning on the second half of a back-to-back. So that's how they're going to open the year. Well, obviously a lot of stuff to happen before then. So that's been episode 32 of the Everyday Sens podcast. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on the YouTube page. If you're listening on audio, head over to the YouTube page and subscribe. And also don't forget to subscribe to everydaysens.com for in-depth analysis. We're going to ramp that up as the season gets going. I'll be throwing some articles in there as well. We'll be doing all of that, some highlight analysis, all the works. So head on over to the website, subscribe to there. Before you do that, though, subscribe to the YouTube page. Leave a like, comment. Let us know what you think. Are we being biased? Are we being too unbiased? We are, I don't know. I don't care, to be honest, but we appreciate everyone's opinions because it's a subjective thing that we're doing, right? So that'll be it for episode 32, and we will see you on Friday.